Hello, I'm John Walter, instructor for English 302, sections M01 and M03, and this is the second half of the lecture on enthymemes. So if you haven't seen the first half of the lecture on Introduction to Enthymemes, you want to watch that first since you're jumping in about the middle of the lecture. And as a reminder, this second half of the lecture we're going to begin with taking a closer look at enthymemes, kind of a little more in depth. Again, the basis for this is going to be drawn from the handout, though I'll extend some of the ideas there to begin with. So if you haven't seen the handout, you should take a look at that. And then we will talk about the importance of precision in writing enthymemes. And finally, we will look at some enthymemes that have been constructed based on the reading about Inside Out that I asked you to take a look at for this week. So, again, an enthymeme makes an assertion. It provides a reason connected to the assertion using because or therefore. An enthymeme contains a shared term. An enthymeme presents both the claim and the assertion as independent clauses, and an enthymeme has an unstated assumption. And if the first four conditions are true, if the enthymeme that you've written meets the first four conditions there, then it will have an unstated assumption, and we'll take a look at that more closely in a couple minutes here. So we can write enthymemes in one of two ways. It can be idea 1 because idea 2. An example there is Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman because Batman is a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill rather than an alien with inhuman powers. Or we can write an enthymeme in the form of idea 1, therefore idea 2. An example of that is Batman is a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill rather than an alien with inhuman powers. Therefore, Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman. And if we take a look, let's take a look at the first one there. They both basically have the same wording, so the same conditions are going to apply to both. Well, let's take a look back at the five elements of an enthymeme. An enthymeme must make an assertion. We take a look at the first one, the assertion: Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman. That assertion is actually in both. So, an enthymeme must provide a reason connected to the assertion using because or therefore. In the first one, Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman because Batman, etc. In the second one, we have, so that's the because connection, and the second one is the therefore connection. Batman is a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill rather than an alien with inhuman powers. Therefore, Batman, and continue off the conclusion there. So we've got, in both of those, we do have an assertion, and that assertion is connected to its reason using because or therefore. And there must be a shared term to make an enthymeme an enthymeme. The shared term there must be a shared term a term that both the claim and the reason share. So if we take a look at the first one, Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman because Batman is a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill rather than an alien with inhuman powers. We find here, Batman is mentioned in both a cooler superhero. So this idea of superhero is going through as the shared term there. In both of those, because the claim is about a superhero, the claim is about Batman being a cooler superhero, and we have Batman and superhero shared terms going throughout the entire enthymeme there. So yes, both idea 1, idea 2, the claim and the reason have shared terms. Now, fourth condition to be an enthymeme: the claim and the assertion must be presented as independent clauses. So let's take a look. Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman. We could put a period there. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, it's an independent clause. There's a subject, Batman. There's a verb, is. And that's all a complete sentence needs. It's not dependent on anything. It's independent clause. Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman. Period. Independent clause. Let's take a look at the reason. Batman is a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill rather than an alien with inhuman powers. Yes, that's also an independent clause, and we could look into that. Though this class, as talked about the expectations for this class, ideas about what an independent clause is and a dependent clause are kind of assume that you know. If you don't know, let me know. You can send me a private email, and I can point you to resources to help you so you can learn how to determine what a dependent and an independent clause are. So, fifth element of an enthymeme. If an enthymeme makes an assertion, provides a reason that it's connected to the assertion using because or therefore, if both the reason and the claim, both the reason and the assertion, contain a shared term, and both are presented as independent clauses, then the enthymeme will have an unstated assumption. So, what is the unstated assumption? These enthymemes are, essentially the same. The only difference is that one connects the claim and reason with because, the other connects the claim and reason with therefore. Otherwise, they're exactly the same in terms of the four conditions. So, the unstated assumption. The handout actually walks you through how you can sort of change wording around, cross out terms, and find the unstated assumption. You might want to do that. This would actually be a really good exercise. Just grab the handout, go through that description again about how to find an unstated assumption. We will practice that later, but next week, but this is, might be a good time to give that a try. But if you were to do that, you will find essentially the unstated assumption is along the lines of a human who becomes a superhero through training and skill is a cooler superhero than an alien with inhuman powers. Now, of course, one of the things we had mentioned that enthymemes deal with contingent issues. If we come back here, enthymemes are used to argue probable solutions, possible actions, and reasonable connections. So what we've got here in this argument that Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman. This is something we can debate. This is not a factual claim in the way that the idea that it is raining outside, it's raining today, is a factual claim. It's an issue that we can debate. It's an issue that people are going to disagree on. Reasonable people are going to disagree on. Even though I really think Batman's a cooler superhero than Superman, I will acknowledge that reasonable people can think that Superman is a better superhero than Batman. And how we define what is a cooler superhero depends on what we want to foreground, what values, what conditions, what criteria we want to define as makes a superhero cool or cooler than another superhero. So obviously the conditions that this enthymeme uses, the unstated assumption, is that what defines a cool superhero and how we can compare superheroes, one way of comparing superheroes for their coolness is whether or not they are an actual human who has, through training and skill, become a superhero, as opposed to something like being an alien with inhuman powers or someone who is granted superpowers through some strange thing like Peter Parker being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming Superman, or someone being born with a mutant gene who then is a mutant. The idea here of just an ordinary human being who pushes themselves to become an extraordinary individual and therefore is able to be a superhero. That's one way of defining a cool superhero. We can argue about that. But that is the unstated assumption in this enthymeme that we've got presented here. And so that's how an unstated assumption works. It is, the ideas that we use to base our logic on, the ideas that we're valuing, that we're foregrounding, that is what the argument rests on. And it is in the where people are going to disagree generally, is they're going to disagree with the assumptions, with your unstated assumption. And we'll talk more about that in the next couple of weeks. But I just want to throw this idea out here. And that's how we find, that's why understanding the unstated assumption is important. It's both important for you figuring out what your unstated assumptions are in the enthymemes that you're creating, so that you understand the logic behind the argument that you are making. You're understanding the values, assumptions, etc. that your argument is based upon. Therefore, because then you can figure out, is my audience going to accept this? Is my audience going to believe this assumption? Or do I have to convince them that this assumption is correct? And if you have to convince them, then what you actually do is you have to develop your argument more by actually making a series of arguments that lead to your final. So you can make the final statement, Batman is a cooler superhero than Superman, and then the structure of the argument you're going to make, you would then be leading your audience through a series of smaller arguments that convince them, ideally, that what makes a cool superhero is just an ordinary person, just a human who becomes a superhero by pushing themselves to become an extraordinary individual. So, like I said, we'll take a look at that more closely in the coming weeks. But I want to move on to the idea of precision. Why being precise. The more precise you can make your enthymeme, the stronger your enthymeme is. And so we'll talk about what I mean by that and why it's important. So generally speaking, when writing enthymemes, and I should know that this also holds true for theses. So both enthymemes and thesis statements. Generally speaking, the more specific you can be, the more precise you can be in the exact conditions and terms that you are using, the stronger your enthymeme or your thesis will be, and the easier it will be to support and defend your enthymeme. The stronger and easier, the easier it will be to support and defend your thesis, so your argument. So the more precise, the more specific. So the more specific you can make your claim, the more precise you can be in your wording, and the conditions under which you're making your claim, the conditions under which your argument would apply, the stronger your argument will be, and the easier it will be to support and defend what you're stating. And one thing to remember that when you're creating enthymemes, and when you're creating thesis statements or theses, for topic sentences and stuff, you're rarely beholden to a specific enthymeme or thesis during the process of constructing and drafting your argument. As with your writing in general, you should expect to revise your enthymeme during the process. So during your entire process of constructing your argument, from start to finish, even all the way to when you're revising. You expect to actually change, to revise, to fine-tune your enthymeme, to fine-tune your thesis. Let's take a look at some examples of why this is important, what I mean by this and why it's important. As I wrote, in this lecture, you're rarely beholden to a specific enthymeme or thesis during the process of constructing and drafting your argument. What I actually initially wrote was you're never beholden. So I used the word never rather than rarely. And after I wrote the word never, I thought, actually, no, that's not good. The reason why it's not good is that while it's generally true that no one's ever going to get upset if you try to revise your enthymeme or your thesis, there are cases in which someone might say, no, you cannot. I am not going to let you. It could be that you've got a really mean teacher who makes you turn in a thesis statement and then says, nope, you've turned in your thesis statement. You've turned in your enthymeme. You can't change it. You've got to deal with what you've given me. I say that that's a mean teacher because, there could be good reasons for doing that, and one might be to point out that there are times when someone could actually do that to then have you sort of figure out, oh my gosh, I've written this horrible, this thesis, this enthymeme that isn't going to work. I need to revise it, and then you can sort of learn through the problem of actually not being able to. But generally, as a good teacher is going to let you revise these things as you're working with them. They're not going to be beholden you to it. And so that's why, I wanted to say rarely rather than never. And also it could be that you might be playing a game where you actually are required to, present a thesis, present an enthymeme, and then figure out how to support it because that's part of the rules of the game. So again, the problem with using never there rather than rarely is that in trying to support, in terms of an argument, if you use an absolutist term like never, all someone has to do is find one example where it doesn't hold. And you can say, oh, well, that's just quibbling. Yes, but no. If you want to claim never, this is never the case, But there are instances when it is the case, you are technically have made a factually incorrect argument. You have made an argument that people can defeat. And so what you do is you use a term, like you take a term like never and you turn it to a term, use the word rarely. This is actually called a qualifier or hedging, but hedging, it's hedging in a good way. You're recognizing that there are contingencies, there are situations in which what you were trying to say may not be true, and therefore you then revise your language to acknowledge that those may exist and account for them. Because I can say that you're rarely beholden to a specific enthymeme or thesis during the process of constructing and drafting your argument. And if someone says, "I had a teacher who told us we couldn't do that," or I'm playing this game, we could play a game in which we can't. I can say, "Yeah, exactly." That's why I say rarely. There are times, special conditions, where someone might say, "No, you must use the enthymeme that you created from the start." But most of the time, in most of the situations in which you are constructing arguments, that's not going to be the case. So that is one reason why you want to use, you want to be precise in your language by using such things as rarely. Another example of enthymemes and precision, well, we can actually talk about being more precise in the language that you use, toning down absolutist claims such as never to account for the unusual circumstances. A much more common need for revision has to do with the conditions under which your argument applies. An example of that. If we look closely at the enthymeme, we've already seen cats make better pets than dogs for busy people because cats are more self-sufficient than dogs. In general, that's a fine enthymeme, but it can be revised. And the reason why it can be revised, the reason why it actually may need to be revised, may need to become more precise, is that in this day and age, you can be a very busy person and not actually ever have to leave home for extended periods of time. We can work from home today. We can go to school from home today. And, none of you, we are not actually required to be on campus to take this class. And there are whole degree programs where you can go to school online. You can work from home. You can order, a place like the DC metro area, you can have your groceries delivered to you. You can have pretty much everything you need to buy delivered to you. So you don't actually have to leave your home unless you want to. And so you can be a very busy person and not leave your home. And the assumption, so the reason why this is a problem, why the enthymeme is a problem, is that it has, if you were to look for the unstated assumption, part of the assumption is that busy people are often not at home or often leave home for extended periods of time. And so that's obviously a problem, because someone can say, well, I don't need a cat. I don't need an animal that's self-sufficient. I'm home a lot. I'm home most of the time. And so the enthymeme, cats make better pets than dogs for busy people because cats are more self-sufficient than dogs, is a less precise version of the argument. It can be refined to be more precise, so it better meets, it limits the criteria and gets more specific about the context in which the argument is being made, and it gets more precise about the conditions under which a cat would make a better pet than a dog for certain types of people, for certain types of lifestyles. So one way we can revise that enthymeme is to write, cats make better pets than dogs for busy people who are rarely home because cats are more self-sufficient than dogs and can be left at home alone for longer periods of time. So you can see there how that second version, the more precise version, actually limits the conditions under which the argument is being made. It's not just people who are busy, but it's people who are busy, and by being busy, they are not home a lot. They're frequently not at home. That is the conditions under which that argument really is being made. And you can see how that makes a stronger argument, because there are fewer people who can raise an objection. There are fewer people who can say, well, I'm busy all the time, but I'm home most of the time too. Those people are no longer a problem. That objection is no longer a problem for your argument. Likewise, it's easier to defend because there's fewer, by having fewer people who can object, by having fewer objections that can be made, then it's just easier. It's easier to defend, easier to support. And so precision is really important in making both enthymemes and in turn also making theses. And this is why actually revising, because most of the time you're going to come up with an enthymeme, you're going to come up with a thesis, and it's going to be, a good general one. But as you continue to work and develop the idea and support the idea, you're going to start finding that there are conditions that you haven't accounted for yet, that as you develop your thinking and work through all the problems inherent in constructing your argument, you're going to figure out the conditions that you need to qualify for. You're going to need the conditions under which you need to make exceptions. And then by understanding those conditions, where there are exceptions, where you need to qualify what you're saying, you go back and you revise your enthymeme, you go back and revise your thesis statement, and in the end you end up with something that's more precise, both in terms of the language it uses and in the terms of the conditions under which your claim operates. And in that way, you make a stronger argument. You make an argument that is more easily and readily defendable. Okay, so to wrap up this lecture, I want to take a look at I want to create some enthymemes based on the inside-out reading. The reading based on Jennifer Talrico's Does Pixar's Inside Out Show How Memory Actually Works? If you have not read that essay, you should probably stop this lecture for a moment. It'll take you about 5 to 10 minutes to read it. It shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes for the most part, unless you read very slowly. And if you read very slowly, that's just how it is. And I will note that I'm actually read very slowly for someone who is an English, kind of a graduate school in English. Most of my colleagues actually read much faster than I do, so I understand what it means to be a slow reader. But for the most part, it should take about 5 to 10 minutes to read the essay. And it's meant to be a fairly straightforward essay, so stop, read it. I'll note that we're actually also going to I'm going to talk about the essay. I'm going to talk about Does Pixar's Inside Out Show How Memory Actually Works next week. Next week we're going to look at rhetorical analysis, and I'm actually in the lecture on rhetorical analysis. I'm going to be referring to this essay about Inside Out, and that's going to be the example rhetorical analysis. Then I'm going to ask you to read some other articles and to do your own rhetorical analysis of those articles for your homework next week. So you're going to want to read Pixar's Inside Out so you understand both this lecture better and you understand the lectures from next week. So like I said, if you haven't read it yet, stop, read it, take you 5-10 minutes, and come back to this. Okay, so assuming that you have read Does Pixar's Inside Out Show How Memory Actually Works, we can continue on and we can talk about how we can construct some theses out of it. How we can construct some enthymemes out of it. We can construct an enthymeme for the central idea of an argument, essentially its thesis, and for the various claims that are made to support that thesis. To do so, we need to kind of understand what the argument is, what the thesis of Does Pixar's Inside Out Show How Memory Actually Works? So one way we might paraphrase the thesis of the article, and you can of course paraphrase in other ways. And we'll talk more about paraphrase and summary in the coming weeks. But generally, when we paraphrase something, when we summarize something, we're actually summarizing for a purpose. We're summarizing for a reason, and therefore our summary. There's a difference between a general sort of what we might call an abstract summary, which is sort of a objective, just reporting of what the article, what the report says, and a summary that is done for a specific purpose. And because summaries done for specific purposes, rather than just giving a general report of, are going to focus on particular issues and not focus on other issues. Again, we'll talk more about summary and paraphrase in the coming weeks. But one paraphrase of the argument in Does Pixar's Inside Out Show How Memory Actually Works might be this. Pixar's Inside Out does a reasonably good job of representing the complexities of human memory, especially the connection between memory and emotions, although it does misrepresent some of the more technical aspects of memory. So, if you've read the article, this hopefully, ideally, will make sense to you. So, from that thesis, we can create an enthymeme. And again, because we're making an argument about, we're kind of looking at what the argument might be made in this. Pixar's Inside Out can make a great tool for teaching the role memory plays in our lives, but it's not the best tool for teaching the technical processes of memory because it doesn't represent all memory processes accurately. So again, if you've read the article, you understand why I'm making that claim, and you can see, the article itself doesn't necessarily actually talk about using the movie as a teaching tool, but that's really what she's getting at in that article, is that where does it represent memory accurately? And it's a movie theoretically for kids, though it's a movie that's enjoyed by everyone, or the audience is not just for children; it's for all ages. And this idea here is that if we're looking at does this accurately represent how memory works, then the reason why we're concerned about that is, is this telling us how giving us an accurate representation of memory, and does that mean, are we learning about memory? Because as she notes, the people who made the movie consulted with experts and consulted with researchers, memory researchers, when they made this, because they wanted to accurately represent things. But what they were mostly interested in accurately representing was the relationship between memory and emotion. So, again, the enthymeme. Pixar's Inside Out can make a great tool for teaching the role memory plays in our lives, but it's not the best tool for teaching the technical process of memory. So that's the claim. Because we're now moving into the reason, because it doesn't represent all memory processes accurately. You can see there we've got a repetition of it referring back to Inside Out, memory processes, and the idea of representing memory processes is there. So we've got the shared terms. Both are independent clauses, and so we could then find the unstated assumption, which of course is going to be something along the lines of a good tool for teaching the role of memory processes is what makes a movie good for as a teaching tool to teach about the role of memory plays is one that actually represents memory properly. That's the unstated assumption there. So, while we can make an enthymeme, about the overall argument itself, we can also take a look at the various claims, because again, an argument has an overarching enthymeme that you can make, but also often complex arguments, which is most arguments we're going to be engaging with in this class, are actually based on reasons that are themselves arguments. And so we can also make enthymemes from the various claims and reasons Tarenko uses to support her thesis, such as how the movie misrepresents how we retrieve memory. So one of the things she points out, one of the things, ways that she says this movie does not accurately represent how we retrieve memories, which is one of the problems if we want to talk about the movie in terms of memory, representing the processes of memory. So her claim, again paraphrased, is that researchers believe that when we remember something, we draw information from multiple neural modules. And she explains what neural modules are. Basically, neural modules are where we process basic cognitive functions, such as emotion, vision, hearing, and language. And so when we remember again, we are actually drawing information from these multiple neural modules, and then we reconstruct the memory from the various elements that we draw from those modules. A process Inside Out misrepresents when it shows Riley accessing her memories by visiting a memory library and pulling memory globes off the shelves. So, again, the movie represents the main character is just having to, when she wants to access a memory, she just goes to the memory library and she finds the specific memory on a shelf, and it's all there ready to go, and she just pulls it off the shelf and takes a look at it. And that is a misrepresentation of memory. That's a misrepresentation of how we recollect, how we remember things. So, the claim that Tarenko makes is that while this makes for a good visual movie storytelling, it does not accurately represent how memory works. So we want to make an enthymeme out of that. we can do something along the lines of, inside out misrepresents the process of remembering because it shows Riley accessing memory globes from a central memory library, even though researchers believe that the process of remembering involves reconstructing memories from multiple cognitive centers known as neural modules. So again, we have a claim and a reason. They're independent clauses. They're independent clauses, both of them. The claim and the reason are connected by the term because, and they have shared terms. And so, of course, they're going to have an unstated assumption, which you can determine if you want. So that is, what I want to, the idea I want to get across here is that we can use enthymemes to understand other people's arguments. If you want to sort of, evaluate this argument, does this, where is this argument's strengths? Where is this argument's weaknesses? Do I disagree with this argument? You can create enthymemes about an argument. You can create an enthymeme that represents the overarching argument, and then you can create enthymemes that look at the various sub-arguments, the various arguments that support the main argument. And so we can create enthymemes both to understand other people's arguments, as well as create enthymemes to represent our own arguments. And again, we will be working with enthymemes throughout this semester. Particularly, we'll focus our focus will be on enthymemes will be over the next few weeks. We'll look at how we can use enthymemes to both to understand other people's arguments, how we can use enthymemes to represent our own arguments as a tool for helping us develop them, and then eventually we'll be talking about, once we've constructed an enthymeme, we can actually then use that enthymeme as a means of inventing our argument, because basically once you have an enthymeme, as we'll see in a couple weeks, the enthymeme, when we understand its unstated assumption, actually tells us what we need to know, what our audience needs to know. We then, if we build off of chapter 2 from the craft of research I asked you to read today, the connecting with your audience has expectations, and so when you actually look at what you're trying to say, the argument you're trying to make, and you look at what your expectations and needs your audience has, what your audience is going to, what you can expect your audience to agree with, what you expect your audience need to be convinced of, your enthymeme actually helps you create a roadmap that actually can then just lead you right through what you need to do in making your argument. And we'll be looking at that in the coming weeks. So thank you. And if you have any questions, again, please post them to the discussion forums and we can talk about them.